So, here we are, day 4 of the quarantine. And now I'm going to give you my first in-house lecture about World War II. I hope everybody's good out there. Colin, stop playing chess. Olivia, put your phone away. Jeslina, pay attention. All right, here we go. So we're going to talk about FDR and the foreign policy leading into World War II. First of all, let's talk about isolationism, because that's the key term. Isolationism is going to be the way of the world, really, for almost all major countries that are going through the Great Depression, and they're all kind of turning inward. The difference is some of those Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, they've turned to dictatorships and this idea of ultranationalism where the state must grow to survive. So that is going to present FDR with some unique challenges as the rest of the world, some countries in particular, they start to get on a war footing. How much should he get ready for a war when the American public is still focused on the Great Depression? And so for the first half of his presidency, he is focused solely on the Depression. His first term almost entirely on the Depression, and very little is done foreign policy-wise. Let's take a look at some of the things that we see happening in the country during the time. First of all, there's two parts of FDR and his philosophy of foreign policy. The first thing is that it's time to end imperialism. In reality, a lot of the colonies that the Americans had were costly, and to maintain those and be able to protect those was a drain on the system during the Great Depression. So here's some of the things that FDR did to try to limit and get rid of really the old policy of imperialism. It follows on the heels of Hoover, who actually started some of this in the first place, and continues into his administration. And really, by the time we get to the eve of World War I, the United States has extricated itself out of most places in the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and even in the Pacific. All right, so let's talk about a few things. First, the good neighbor policy. No card term. The good neighbor policy was started with Hoover, and it was extended a lot to FDR. He actually went on a tour of South America, and while he was doing that, he actually went to the Pan American Conference, and his foreign ministers went to the Pan American conferences. And at those conferences, the Latin American countries had always wanted to introduce a resolution saying that no member of the states in the Western Hemisphere will attack or occupy another member. The United States had always blocked that resolution. Not anymore. The United States actually sponsored that position, said the United States would be removing all their military from Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. And that went over really well in the area, and that's why it's called the Good Neighbor Policy. The United States actually started signing reciprocity treaties to encourage trade, free trade, between all of these countries. If we lowered our tariffs, would they lower their tariffs? So the Hawley-Smoot tariff was essentially lowered by presidential declaration. He didn't have to go through the Senate. So those tariffs go down, and that was to help in the Great Depression and improve the relationship with these Latin American countries, which it did. FDR was loved down there. Also, the Platt Amendment in Cuba was eradicated. The United States would not be sending troops into Cuba, promised not to use force to intervene in Cuban affairs, and we might regret that a couple of decades later when Fidel Castro comes into power, but for the time being, it was going to be a better relationship for the Cubans and the Americans, and that is another aspect of the Good Neighbor Policy. Secretary Hull is responsible for many of these treaties that would create a better sense of unity in the Western Hemisphere, and it probably helped to have a little bit more unity as World War II would be on the horizon. In the Pacific, the United States actually realized that our gem in the Pacific, our one place, was the Philippines. And we'd been promising independence for a very long time. Finally, in 1934, Roosevelt helps pass the Tiding-McDuffie Act, which says you will get your independence in 12 years, guaranteed, no matter what. We will remove all troops from the Philippines except for some key naval bases and air bases in that area. And we kept those. However, by essentially showing the world that we were leaving, the Japanese kind of cast an eye on that part of the world and realized that U.S. power was not going to stop them from expanding. Tour of South America, like I mentioned, that's FDR. I drew that. I didn't hire an artist or anything. That was me. It wasn't, like a professional. But maybe I should be a professional. Ditch this gig. So, anyways, he did go, one of the first presidents to actually tour multiple capitals, even all the way down in Uruguay, where he helped sign the agreement that U.S. forces would not be used internally in any of these areas. The one big test came with Mexico. Mexico, as a government, decided it was going to nationalize their mining interests and their oil interests. Well, a lot of those oil interests were owned by American companies. So they essentially confiscated their tools, their equipment, and even their oil lands without much compensation. FDR did not send troops, as he promised, negotiated a settlement to that, where essentially the American businessmen, the oil companies, they lost out. So it wasn't always popular inside the U.S., but we and FDR did actually follow the good neighbor policy. And then the second and last thing I'll be talking about here, and then let you go about your daily business, whatever your quarantine routine is. Isolating from conflict that was starting to emerge around the world. Let's talk about it really quick. There's just two things. One is allowing these older treaties to lapse. Many of them had an expiration date. The Nine-Power Treaty from the Washington Naval Conference, which we learned about last week during the 1920s after World War I to try to limit the size of navies, that was about to lapse. In 1934, they met again to negotiate, and the Japanese demanded parity. They wanted to have the same size navy as the UK and the United States. And essentially, talks broke down, the treaty collapsed, and Japan was going to go on a massive building spree to build up their navy and their air forces before World War II. And the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty was falling apart. Adolf Hitler had come to power, and there was a big conference in Munich in 1938, Munich, Germany. And it was in Germany, but it was actually the conference was hosted by Hitler's buddy Benito Mussolini from Italy, the other dictator. And they negotiated in this Munich conference that German-speaking people living in Czechoslovakia would actually be allowed to join the German Empire. The Germans had already taken over Austria, and the Nazi armies were marching. They violated virtually every aspect of the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States did nothing about it. Neither did the other powers of Europe. The Munich conference was known as the big appeasement of Hitler. Just give in to him and he won't want any more. This will be the last thing. But in 1938, it became very clear that it wasn't just Czechoslovakia he was going to get his hands on. He wanted Poland, Russia, and the rest of Europe, and that's what will start the war in 1939, the invasion of Poland. Italy and Japan, when we look at it, it's a couple of things. First of all, both were the first to start these totalitarian military regimes. Mussolini in Italy, and then Hideki Tojo on behalf of the emperor in Japan. And they talked about how ultranationalism was the wave of the future, that they needed to expand their power, and it had a racial element to it. The Italians thought that the whole Mediterranean belonged to them, like the Roman times. And the Japanese thought that they were inferior. Every other Asian group around them was inferior to the Japanese, and so they had a dominant role. That was their destiny, when it was to take over most of China. In 1931, they did just that. They invaded northern China. That violated the Nine-Power Treaty, and the rest of the world kind of, shook their fingers at Japan and gave them a slap on the wrist with some minor sanctions. But in reality, the Japanese were getting a foothold in mainland China, and they were going to expand that. And that is when Japan, Germany, and Italy all left the League of Nations and joined together in a pact, an axis, the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Rome and Berlin had already had a treaty dating back to the 30s, but then Japan joined that in 1940. Italy then invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and their war machine was going. They were going to claim all of North Africa, or try to claim all of North Africa. And many people, again, shook their fingers at Italy, said, no, you shouldn't do that. But the United States did nothing and kept ourselves out of that, and passed acts saying that Americans could not go to Italy or anywhere in the war zones, and that was to try to keep out of that conflict. And when the Japanese invaded northern China, just 6 years later, in 1937, they used that as a jumping off point to invade the rest of mainland China and down the coast. This is when World War II started in Asia. The United States stance was to stay out of it. In fact, we passed Neutrality Act saying that we were neutral and Americans cannot go into the fighting zone or the war zone. Congress passed those acts. Roosevelt reluctantly passed them, but this is the point in 1937, after watching what Hitler was doing and what Japan did in 1937, FDR has now changed his mind. He does not want to be isolationist. He starts speaking a lot with Winston Churchill of England, and Churchill's asking for action, and very soon the United States is going to turn course. FDR basically begs the American people in a famous speech called the quarantine speech that it's time to quarantine the aggressors. Quarantine, you know what that's like. And we want to make sure that we will get involved in helping our allies. By 1940, the Japanese and Chinese are in full-scale war. Germany has invaded Poland. England and France are now in full-scale war against Germany. Russia has actually stayed out of it. They're neutral. The United States has stayed out of it and is neutral. And the only thing we can say that the United States did leading up to it is that there was an oil treaty with Japan, and they relied heavily on American oil. And that was going to expire in 1940. And the United States began to use that as a token to negotiate with the Japanese and say, hey, get out of China, and we'll start sending the oil and other trade things. And those talks began to break down. And the Japanese, as those talks were going, the Japanese hatched a plan. If they could knock out the Pacific Fleet of the United States, they could get access to the oil of Indonesia. And to do that, they would use the Philippines as a base to go get it. And that's exactly what they did with the secret attack in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. And then World War II was on. Thanks for listening. I'll come up with some other great lectures and post them as we move along. You stay safe, America.